The clash of armies has always been more than just blood and steel. It has been the turning point of nations, the foundation of empires and the collapse of kingdoms. In the echoes of gunfire and the roar of cannons, the course of humanity shifted. Some battles were fought for survival, others for dominance, and many for ideals. Each carried within it the weight of generations yet to come. On the fields of Waterloo in 1815, the fate of Europe trembled. Napoleon Bonaparte, the once invincible emperor, sought to reclaim his power after his escape from exile. His forces were seasoned, disciplined, and driven by his charisma. Yet, the alliance of Britain, Prussia, and their allies stood firm. The ground was soaked with rain and mud, slowing maneuvers, but the will to fight never faltered. Hours of relentless musket fire, cavalry charges, and desperate defenses decided not just the fate of Napoleon, but the balance of Europe. When the dust cleared, the legend of Napoleon was finished, and Europe was set on a path of relative stability under a new order. Decades later, in 1863, the hills of Gettysburg bore witness to one of the fiercest struggles of the American Civil War. Union and Confederate forces clashed in 3 days of relentless combat, each side fighting not only for territory, but for their vision of what America should be. The cries of the fallen echoed as lines broke and reformed, as charges surged and failed. The Union stood its ground, and the Confederacy's chance for victory on northern soil slipped away. Gettysburg became a symbol of sacrifice and a turning point in a war that would eventually define freedom and unity for the United States. In the early 20th century, the fields of Europe once again erupted with unimaginable violence during World War I. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 stands as one of the most harrowing examples of industrial warfare. Trenches stretched for miles, filled with mud, fear, and the constant thunder of artillery. Men charged across no man's land only to be cut down by machine guns. The ground itself became a graveyard. Though territorial gains were minimal, the battle symbolized the futility of old strategies against modern weaponry. Yet, it also marked the dawn of new tactics that would forever change warfare as nations began to adapt to the deadly efficiency of mechanized slaughter. World War II brought battles that were global in scale and unmatched in intensity. In 1942, Stalingrad became the crucible of the Eastern Front. German and Soviet forces fought street by street, house by house, in a brutal struggle that reduced the city to rubble. Civilians and soldiers alike endured starvation, cold, and constant bombardment. The Soviets refused to yield, turning the ruins into fortresses and every alley into a killing ground. When the German Sixth Army was finally encircled and forced to surrender, it marked not just a Soviet victory but the beginning of the end for Hitler's ambitions in the East. In the mid-20th century, another defining moment came not on the plains of Europe, but on the shores of Asia. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954 signaled the end of French colonial rule in Indochina. Surrounded in a valley, French forces faced relentless attacks by the Viet Minh, who combined guerrilla tactics with artillery mastery. Trenches crept closer and closer and closer until the French stronghold collapsed. The victory sent shockwaves around the world, heralding the rise of modern guerrilla warfare and inspiring independence movements across continents. Each of these battles carved its name into the story of humanity, shaping nations and ideologies. They remind us that the roar of conflict carries consequences beyond the battlefield, shaping the borders we live within, the freedoms we claim, and the struggles yet to come. History remembers the victors, but the fallen remain etched in the soil, silent witnesses to the cost of shaping the modern world. The Battle of Waterloo in 1815 stands as one of the most decisive clashes in history, a moment where the fate of an entire continent teetered on the edge. It was not merely the end of a campaign, but the conclusion of an era dominated by the genius and ambition of Napoleon Bonaparte. For over a decade, Europe had been shaped by his wars, his victories, and his political reshaping of empires. When he escaped from exile on Elba and returned to France, the continent trembled. Thousands rallied to his side, and in a matter of weeks, the emperor who had once been dethroned was back at the head of an army, determined to reclaim his empire. His enemies, however, had learned the cost of underestimating him. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia quickly renewed their alliance. Quote, The campaign that followed would decide whether Napoleon would again dominate Europe or whether the powers united against him would finally put an end to his ambitions. The decisive confrontation came in Belgium, near the small village of Waterloo, where Napoleon's forces faced the Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Allied army and the approaching Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher. The morning of June 18, 1815, began with heavy rain that turned the ground into thick mud. This seemingly small detail would alter the entire battle. Napoleon delayed his attack to allow the ground to dry, hoping his artillery could be more effective. This delay bought crucial time for the Prussians to march toward the battlefield, a decision that would later haunt him. When the fighting began, it unfolded in waves of brutal assaults and stubborn defenses. Napoleon sought to break Wellington's lines before the Prussians could arrive. French cannons roared, and infantry advanced against fortified farmhouses, such as Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, which became epicenters of resistance. At Hougoumont, British and Allied troops held out against repeated French attacks, their determination preventing Napoleon from turning Wellington's flank. At La Haye-Sainte, German troops fighting under Wellington endured hours of relentless assault until they were eventually overwhelmed. Yet their defense slowed the French advance and drained vital strength from Napoleon's army. The middle of the battle was marked by one of the most famous cavalry charges in history. Waves of French horsemen thundered across the muddy ground, their sabers flashing as they sought to shatter the Allied infantry squares. Again and again they charged, but the squares held firm, bristling with bayonets and steady musket fire. The French cavalry, magnificent in bravery, achieved little more than exhaustion and loss, while the Allied lines endured. By late afternoon, the Prussians finally arrived on the battlefield, striking Napoleon's right flank. This forced him to stretch his already battered forces to hold them back. Still, he gambled everything on one final effort. As the sun began to sink, he ordered the Imperial Guard, his most elite troops, forward in a desperate attempt to smash through Wellington's center. The Guard advanced with discipline and determination, but the Allies stood firm. Musket volleys tore into their ranks, and for the first time in history, the Guard faltered and broke. Their retreat sent shockwaves through the French army. What had once been the symbol of Napoleon's invincibility became the signal of his defeat. The French army collapsed into retreat, and the field was left to the Allies and their Prussian partners. Napoleon fled, his dream of reclaiming his empire shattered. Within weeks, he abdicated once more and was sent into permanent exile on the remote island of St. Helena, where he would live out the remainder of his life under close guard. The consequences of Waterloo reached far beyond the battlefield. Napoleon's defeat ended more than his reign. It ended 2 decades of near-constant warfare in Europe. The victors gathered at the Congress of Vienna to redraw the map of Europe and restore balance among the great powers. Britain emerged as the leading global force, while France was contained, its imperial ambitions finished. The stability that followed would last for decades, allowing Europe to develop without the shadow of constant war. Waterloo became more than a battle. It became a symbol. For some, it represented the triumph of unity over tyranny. For others, it was the tragic downfall of a man whose brilliance and ambition reshaped a continent. The echoes of that day continue to resonate, reminding us how one battle, fought in a muddy field in Belgium, forever altered the destiny of nations. The Battle of Gettysburg in 1863 is remembered as one of the most pivotal moments in American history, a clash that not only shaped the outcome of the Civil War, but also defined the future of a nation torn in two. By the summer of that year, the war had dragged on for more than 2 years with no end in sight. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, confident after victories in Virginia, launched an invasion of the North. His aim was bold: deliver a decisive blow on Union soil, sway public opinion in the North toward peace, and possibly encourage foreign powers like Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy. His Army of Northern Virginia marched into Pennsylvania, where the Union Army of the Potomac, commanded by General George G. Meade, moved to intercept him. The collision of these two forces near the small town of Gettysburg would become the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil. The first day of the battle, July 1, saw Confederate forces pushing Union troops back through the town of Gettysburg. Union soldiers retreated to the high ground south of town, forming strong defensive positions on Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and Cemetery Ridge. These elevated positions would prove critical in the days to come. Although the Confederates had gained ground on the first day, they had not achieved a decisive victory, and the Union Army held a formidable line. On July 2, Lee attempted to break the Union positions with a series of fierce assaults on both flanks. The fighting was brutal and relentless. To the south, areas such as the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, Devil's Den, and Little Round Top became scenes of desperate struggle. At Little Round Top, Union Colonel Joshua Chamberlain and his regiment famously held the far left flank, repelling repeated Confederate attacks and even launching a bayonet charge that drove their enemies back. These moments of valor prevented the Confederates from breaking through and ensured the Union Army maintained its strong defensive line. The second day also brought devastation to the Union center, where intense fighting engulfed the Peach Orchard and the Wheat Field. Thousands fell in brutal hand-to-hand combat, yet neither side could gain a decisive advantage. As night fell, the fields were littered with the dead and wounded, but the Union still held its ground. July 3 brought the climax of the battle. Lee, believing the Union center had been weakened, ordered a massive frontal assault against Cemetery Ridge. This attack, known as Pickett's Charge, saw nearly 12,000 Confederate soldiers march across open fields under heavy Union artillery and rifle fire. It was an act of incredible courage, but also of grim futility. The Confederates advanced in perfect lines, only to be torn apart by the Union defenses. The few who reached the Union lines were overwhelmed. Within an hour, the charge was shattered, and the Confederate army was in retreat. It was a devastating loss, and Lee's gamble had failed. The aftermath of Gettysburg was staggering. More than 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing over the 3 days of fighting. The battlefield was transformed into a landscape of suffering, the town of Gettysburg overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the carnage. Meanwhile, the skies above the battlefield saw the rise of air power, with reconnaissance planes guiding artillery fire and fighter aircraft dueling above the trenches. The Somme, though a disaster in many respects, foreshadowed the future of modern combat. For the Germans, the Somme was equally devastating. Though they had inflicted terrible losses on the Allies, they too suffered enormous casualties and were forced to commit reserves they could ill afford while still fighting at Verdun. The relentless pressure weakened their army, straining morale and resources. The German high command began to realize that the war would be one of endurance, where no quick victory was possible. By the time the battle ended in November 1916, after more than 4 months of fighting, the Allied forces had advanced only a few miles. The front lines had shifted, but no decisive breakthrough had been achieved. The cost, however, was staggering. Over 1 million men killed, wounded, or missing on all sides. The countryside was left unrecognizable, a landscape of mud, craters, and skeletal ruins. The Somme became a lasting symbol of the futility of trench warfare and the colossal human cost of strategies that failed to adapt quickly enough to modern weapons. For Britain, it was also a tragic coming of age. Thousands of young men from the Appal's battalions, recruited from the same towns and communities, perished together on the battlefield, leaving entire neighborhoods back home devastated by loss. Yet, despite the horror, the Somme did achieve some results. It relieved pressure on the French at Verdun, inflicted heavy losses on the German army, and forced the enemy to rethink its defensive strategies. It also pushed forward the evolution of tactics and technologies that would eventually break the deadlock of trench warfare. Still, the legacy of the Somme is one of sorrow. It embodies the senseless slaughter of a generation, a war where courage and sacrifice were met with mud, wire, and machine gun. To this day, the memory of the Somme stands as a warning of the cost of war and the fragility of human life when nations clash in the furnace of modern battle. The Battle of Stalingrad in 1942 stands as one of the most brutal and decisive clashes in human history, a struggle that not only determined the fate of World War II Eastern Front, but also reshaped the destiny of nations. What began as Adolf Hitler's attempt to secure a vital industrial city on the Volga River turned into a titanic contest of endurance, where entire armies were ground down in a storm of fire, rubble, and blood. Stalingrad was more than a battle over territory. It became a test of will, fought street by street, house by house, and at times room by room. By the summer of 1942, Germany had already invaded deep into the Soviet Union. After the failure to capture Moscow the year before, Hitler turned his focus southward, seeking the oil fields of the Caucasus. To secure his flank, he ordered the capture of Stalingrad, a major industrial hub and a city that bore the name of his sworn enemy, Joseph Stalin. Hofhod. The symbolic value of conquering Stalingrad was immense. For the Soviets, however, losing the city was unthinkable. Thus, the stage was set for one of history's most ferocious battles. The German Sixth Army, supported by Axis allies, advanced on Stalingrad in late summer. Initially, their superior firepower and experience allowed them to push the Soviets back. Luftwaffe rained destruction on the city, reducing entire districts to rubble. Yet, the very destruction intended to weaken Soviet defenses became their strength. The ruins provided cover, choke points, and ambush sites, turning the city into a fortress. Soviet soldiers, armed with little more than rifles and grenades, fought from basements, cellar, tank floors, and factory floors. The Volga River, flowing behind the city, became both lifeline and trap. Soviet reinforcements and supplies were ferried across under constant bombardment, while retreat was forbidden by Stalin's infamous "a not one step" Bachkorridor. The fighting soon descended into what German soldiers called Rattenkrieg, rat war. Snipers lurked in shattered buildings, machine guns rattled in stairwells, and combat raged in sewers and across ruined factories. Landmarks such as the Tractor Factory, the Red October Factory, and Pavlov's house became symbols of defiance, where small groups of Soviet troops held out against overwhelming assaults. Every block was contested, often changing hands multiple times in a single day. The Germans, who had expected to sweep through quickly, found themselves trapped in a nightmare of attrition. As autumn turned to winter, the balance began to shift. The Soviets, under General Zhukov, planned a massive counteroffensive. While the Germans bled themselves dry in the city, Soviet forces massed on the flanks where Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops guarded the lines. In November 1942, Operation Uranus was unleashed. Soviet armies surged around Stalingrad, encircling the German Sixth Army in a massive trap. Hitler ordered them to hold their ground, promising supplies by air. But the Luftwaffe could not deliver the necessary tonnage, and soon the besieged army faced starvation, freezing cold, and dwindling ammunition. Inside the pocket, conditions were desperate. German soldiers, once the conquerors of Europe, now huddled in ruins, eating horse meat and watching comrades die from exposure and disease. Morale crumbled as Soviet artillery pounded them day and night. Offers to surrender were rejected under Hitler's orders, but the reality was undeniable. The Sixth Army was doomed. In January 1943, the Soviets launched their final assault. By then, the Germans were too weak to resist effectively. Street by street, the Soviets closed in until the remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered on February 2. Over 90,000 German soldiers marched into captivity, though only a fraction would survive the harsh years of Soviet imprisonment. The once mighty army was destroyed, and Hitler's dream of conquering the Soviet Union lay in ruins. The consequences of Stalingrad were immense. For the first time, Nazi Germany had suffered a catastrophic defeat, one that shattered the myth of its invincibility. The Soviets, buoyed by their victory, seized the initiative and began driving the Germans westward. Stalingrad marked the turning point of the war in the East, the moment when momentum shifted irreversibly against Hitler. Yet, beyond the military significance, the human cost was staggering. Estimates suggest nearly 2 million casualties, including soldiers and civilians. The city itself was reduced to rubble, its population devastated by bombing, starvation, and cold. Stalingrad became a symbol of suffering, sacrifice, and resilience, its name forever linked to both the horrors and the heroism of war. In the end, Stalingrad was not merely a battle for a city, but for the future of Europe. It proved that even the mightiest armies could be broken by endurance, strategy, and unyielding resolve. In the frozen ruins along the Volga, the tide of World War II turned, and with it, the course of modern history. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954 was not only the final showdown between French colonial forces and the Viet Minh, but also a decisive moment that reshaped the global balance of power in the post-World War II era. It was the culmination of years of conflict in Indochina, where the Vietnamese, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh and General Vien Nguyen Giap, waged a determined struggle to free their land from French rule. For the French, victory at Dien Bien Phu was supposed to reaffirm their colonial authority. Instead, it ended in humiliation, signaling the collapse of French power in Asia and igniting a wave of independence movements across the world. The French strategy was rooted in conventional thinking. Believing they could lure the Viet Minh into a decisive confrontation, they established a heavily fortified base at Dien Bien Phu, a remote valley in northwestern Vietnam near the border with Laos. Surrounded by hills, the French constructed strong points, airstrips, and artillery positions, confident in their superior firepower and supply lines. They expected the Viet Minh, who had relied largely on guerrilla warfare, to be unable to mount a serious threat against such a fortified position. But General Giappi had studied his enemy carefully. Instead of avoiding the trap, he turned it on the French. Mobilizing tens of thousands of men and women, the Viet Minh carried heavy artillery, supplies, and equipment through jungles and mountains, often by hand or bicycle. Piece by piece, they dragged cannons into the surrounding hills, camouflaging them and digging an intricate network of trenches and tunnels. What seemed impossible, placing heavy guns in terrain thought impassable, became reality through sheer determination. By March 1954, the siege began. The French garrison found itself under relentless artillery fire from positions they had not believed the Viet Minh could occupy. The airstrip, their lifeline for supplies and reinforcements, was quickly destroyed, leaving the defenders reliant on risky airdrops. But the Viet Minh's anti-aircraft guns made resupply increasingly perilous. As the days turned into weeks, the French strongpoints, codenamed with female names like a Gabrielle, a Beatrice, and a Dominique, came under wave after wave of coordinated assaults. Trenches crept closer and closer to the French lines, choking their defenses and sapping their morale. Inside the valley, conditions deteriorated rapidly. French soldiers endured constant bombardment, dwindling ammunition, and the stench of death. Medical facilities were overwhelmed, food became scarce, and water contaminated. The tropical heat and monsoon rains added to the misery. The defenders drawn from France's colonial troops, including North Africans, foreign legionnaires, and Vietnamese loyalists, fought with courage but were steadily ground down. The promised relief never came. Giap's strategy of protracted siege warfare proved devastatingly effective. Unlike the quick assaults the French had expected, the Viet Minh chose patience and relentless pressure. They dug ever closer, tightening the noose until the French strongpoints were isolated and overwhelmed one by one. After nearly 2 months of fighting, the end came in May 1954. On May 7, the French defenses collapsed. Exhausted, out of ammunition, and with no hope of relief, the survivors surrendered. Out of nearly 16,000 French troops at Dien Bien Phu, thousands were killed, and more than 11,000 were taken prisoner. Many of those captured would not survive the harsh marches and prison camps that followed. The defeat sent shockwaves across the world. For France, it was the death knell of its colonial ambitions in Indochina. The loss at Dien Bien Phu directly led to the Geneva Conference, where Vietnam was temporarily divided along the 17th parallel, paving the way for the withdrawal of French forces. But the wider impact went far beyond Vietnam. The battle inspired anti-colonial movements in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, proving that even a determined colonial power could be defeated by a nationalist movement with the will to endure hardship and sacrifice. For the Vietnamese, Dien Bien Phu became a symbol of resilience and victory against overwhelming odds. It was the triumph of determination, strategy, and popular support over superior firepower and technology. For the world, it marked a turning point in the decline of colonial empires and the rise of independence movements that would define the decades that followed. The echoes of Dien Bien Phu also foreshadowed the future. The departure of the French did not bring peace to Vietnam, but instead opened the door to deeper involvement by the United States, setting the stage for another long and devastating war. Yet, as a single battle, Dien Bien Phu remains one of history's most decisive moments, a clash that signaled the end of an era and the dawn of a new age of struggles for freedom and self-determination. In that remote valley, the world witnessed how a nation, armed with little more than determination, ingenuity, and endurance, could humble a global power and change the course of modern history. From Waterloo's muddy fields to the shattered ruins of Stalingrad and the jungles of Dien Bien Phu, each of these epic battles reminds us that history is not shaped in silence, but in the roar of conflict and the resilience of those who fight. Nations rose and fell, empires crumbled, and new powers emerged, all through the struggles of men and women caught in the fire of war. Their sacrifices, victories, and defeats carved the path to the modern world we know today, leaving behind lessons of courage, ambition, and the heavy cost of conflict that should never be forgotten.